Living the Dream by Chris Maitland of Point Clare, 2250. Narrated by David Tredinnick. Some kids growing up around me in suburban post-war Sydney wanted to be train drivers, nurses, actors, sports stars, and for the smartest kids, maybe a doctor or an airline pilot. As for me, from a very young age, I wanted to be a radio announcer. I was an only child, and in those years before TV, radio was my constant companion. I knew all of the announcers' names, and Mum and Dad bought me a microphone with which to practice. By the time that I reached an age where I could contemplate leaving school, rock and roll music had arrived, and a new breed of radio announcers were now called disc jockeys. They became part of listeners' daily lives, mostly for teenagers, but even for young adults too. With names like John Laws, Bob Rogers, Graham Webb, Ward Austin, Ken Sparks, Alan Lappin, Mike Walsh, and even a zany Canadian import, Mad Mel. My parents separated when I was 11, and I lived with my mother as she struggled to raise her only child in a suburban apartment while working her way through 2 bouts of breast cancer. So I left school at 15 to bring some kind of meaningful wage into our household. 3 months before my 19th birthday, I managed to make my childhood dream a reality, moving to Wollongong to hone my chosen craft as a radio announcer. It was a struggle. The wages were low, accommodation was expensive, and I missed my mates and my mother. Thankfully, I was only an hour away, so I drove home regularly for a great home-cooked meal. 2 years on, I was itching for a return to Sydney, still with hopes of getting a spot on a big Sydney radio station, but all my audition tapes fell on deaf ears, and with my mother's cancer having re-emerged more deadly, I gave up on my desired vocation and moved back in with Mum until I could do no more for her. I worked in other fields that were closely allied to commercial radio until one day a colleague tipped me off that a Sydney radio station was looking to hire and train a sales cadet to sell radio advertising time. I applied and got the job. I was back in the industry I loved, just not on the radio. True to their intentions, I progressed through the ranks until just 20 years after leaving school at 15, with only an intermediate certificate, I was appointed sales manager of Australia's leading radio station, presiding over revenues of $11 million, a large amount in those days. But what does this have to do with aging? I needed to background you to now say I'm there. I'm on the cusp of my 80th birthday. My wife of 54 years and I have recently relocated to the New South Wales Central Coast to be closer to our 2 adult kids and our 4 young grandchildren. I have had an enjoyable and mostly fulfilling working life, and while leaving the radio announcing gig behind me, I have been fortunate to enjoy doing some sports commentary on both radio and TV, while pursuing the sales career that I almost fell into. Although giving up on my childhood dream after only 2 years has remained a what if at the back of my mind. So, upon settling in Gosford, an old radio industry colleague invited me to join the local community radio station. It's a segment of the industry that can be very good or quite bad, but fortunately this local radio station is one of the gems. With my long history in the industry, I was able to bypass the course that teaches what one can and cannot say when talking on the radio. I met the volunteer program coordinator. Everyone is a volunteer here. He took one look at my grey, or is it white, hair and said, "I've got a couple of programs that you could do. 6 o'clock rock, playing the early rock and roll songs I grew up with, and another called Baby Boomers," although my age puts me just a few years ahead of the boomer generation. Almost 60 years to the day from when I began playing vinyl pop records on 2 turntables in a broadcast studio in Wollongong, I now direct a mouse on a studio computer screen to play those very same pop songs. I am living the dream that I thought I'd left behind in Wollongong 60 years ago. Importantly, I get respect from my colleagues here for passing on the knowledge and experience I gained in a lifetime in my chosen field. I like to think that I am aging gracefully, and that at 80, I have a few good years left in me yet. Although I do feel strange when sitting around for drinks after a game at my lawn bowls club, or even sitting among my peers at an old broadcasters' reunion lunch, that I am either the oldest or among the oldest in the room. I seem to have reached this position quite quickly. The end.